Hello viewers, today we'll be repairing two bubble lights. This one is a little bit newer. I believe it's by the Kurt S. Adler brand, and this one is a Noma branded one. So this one has a problem with the bulb. It's not burned out, but it's broke free from the bottom of the socket there, so there's no way to screw it into the string. This one, the bulb is just burned out. So we're going to repair both of these. I have some replacement bulbs here. The ones I just showed are not the right ones. I'm not sure why I had those in this clip of the video. The ones I use are these indicator style bulbs. These happen to be General Electric branded. I got these at the dollar store I think several years ago. You can still find these on Amazon under different brands. These are the closest thing I can find to the original shape. The shape of the glass pot is pretty much identical, which is imperative because the regular C7 candelabra bulbs don't fit. The only problem is the threads are just a hair shorter, and so depending on the size of your bulb, sometimes I'll run into an issue where the thing won't screw into the socket deep enough to make a contact and turn on. I have a testing string of bubble lights here. This one is very similar to, at least the bulbs are very similar anyways, to the first one that we're going to repair. So I'm going to use this string as the test to see if the bulb is going to go deep enough into the socket to work. You can see the difference here. It's very minute, maybe a 1/16 of an inch or maybe an 1/8 of an inch, but sometimes it's enough to cause a problem. We're going to test it now. Let's see what happens. And it works, so this will be okay. So to get the thing open, what we're going to do is I'm going to take a knife that's long and thin, so like a box cutter knife for instance works pretty well. And on this particular bulb there's a pretty distinct seam between the top piece that's red and the bottom piece that's yellow. And I'm going to take the knife and put it in that seam and very gently cut through. And what you're cutting here at this point is glue, not the plastic. There's a little bit of glue that holds the two pieces together. So you just need to slowly work through it and cut off that glue, and that'll allow you to break it in half. And patience is very important in this part, because if you get too upset and cut through it real quick, you'll end up breaking something. So you can see it came apart with relative ease, and now we can pull the old bulb out and we're going to put the new bulb in. And that old bulb does still work, but since it's getting relatively old, it's got a lot of hours on it, and since these aren't exactly that easy to change out, I'm just going to go ahead and replace it while I'm in here doing the repair. So I'm going to hold it in place with hot glue. In this particular instance I'm using a low temperature gun. It doesn't really make a difference because the bulb doesn't get hot enough to melt the glue to the point where it's going to lose its bonding. So I'm going to put a bead of hot glue around the bottom of the bulb, or the plastic part where the actual bulb sits in there, and I'm going to use a copious amount because this glue is going to be holding all the resistance of screwing the thing into the socket, so you want to make sure there's a good bond. And then I'm going to push the bulb through the hole, and I'm going to push it down pretty hard because I want to make sure it goes through the hole as much as possible, because we cannot afford to lose any distance on the threads, because it's already a little bit less than it was to begin with. Now when you push it through, some of the glue is going to get on the threads. After 10 to 15 seconds it's going to start to dry enough that you can just peel it off like I'm doing here. Now I'm going to put it back together, and we're going to use hot glue again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a pretty big bead of glue around the seam here, and you can see there's two holes, one at like 1 o'clock and one at maybe 6 or 7 o'clock or so on this piece here. There's two tabs corresponding on the other side where on the red part, and those holes should line up when you put it back together. Now the reason I use so much glue is because I've tried other methods before, and I find that no matter how hard you try, it never goes back together perfectly, and there's always a little bit of a seam, and you can see it when the bulb is illuminated. When I use this much glue, it kind of creates a good seal, and even though there's a space, the light doesn't shine through and it's not very obvious. So I'm going to press it very hard together because I want to make sure that it goes as close as it can and squeezes out all the extra glue. And then in about 20 seconds or so, when the glue starts to dry, I'm going to break off the excess glue. So you can see it's starting to get there. And now it's about to the point where it's dry enough to do this. I'm just going to take my finger and kind of push it up and down a little bit, and it's going to break off. The excess is going to break off pretty easily. So I'm going to go around the whole bulb and do that. Now the reason why I use the hot glue, there's other glues you can use, but I like to use the hot glue because it's very easy to undo in the future when it needs to be repaired again. So you can see it does remove pretty clean, and once I get it all off, you almost can't even tell, from a couple of feet away looking at it. You'd never know that it was repaired unless you're being unreasonably critical of the thing. You're not going to notice. So there, that circular bead thing came off, a couple of strings there, and now this has been closed up, and it's really got a pretty good seal to it. Here's a clip of it lit up, and I really don't see any obvious evidence of the repair at all. Alright, now we're back to the other one, the vintage Noma one, and this one's going to be a little bit more difficult because the seal is not distinct. In fact, the bulb looks like it got very hot at some point for whatever reason, and almost melted together in a few places. So I'm going to use the same knife, and it's going to be generally the same procedure, but this time I'm more cutting through melted plastic than I am glue. So it's gonna take a lot more effort. This took several minutes to break this one apart. I ended up using 2 different knives in this one because it was giving me so much grief. This other knife is very small. It's also very thin, but it's small. It's like a high precision knife. I don't know what it's called. But I used that, and that was a help as well. Sometimes you got to use a couple different tools to get it done. I've been cutting away at this one for several moments, and it's finally getting ready to break apart. I'll get my hand out of the frame here. You can see the seal is starting to come undone. It was only melted really together at one side, and then the rest of it was okay. So it was just, the difficulty was really overcoming that one part that had kind of melted together. So there we go, we got it open. It does have pretty much the same style bulb as the other light. However, this one, I ran into another roadblock with this one because there is a little tab on this bulb here, and that little tab was preventing me from pulling the bulb through the plastic piece. If my stinking camera would focus, you can see it. There we go. So that tab was a problem. So what I had to do was I took a wire cutter and I started cutting away at it a little bit, and that got most of it off, but even that wasn't enough. So then I took a flat blade screwdriver, and I was able to kind of pry it off in a sense. And once I got that off, I was able to pull the bulb out like I did on the other one. This is what it looks like after I got it off. It was a very soft metal, very malleable. I don't know what it was made of, perhaps some kind of a solder or something. So now with that off, it will pull right out and I can replace it. At this point, it's going to be the same procedure now that I used for the previous bulb. I'm going to put a bead of glue in the bottom of the base here to hold the bulb in place. I used a copious amount of glue, and I'm going to push the bulb in as hard as I can into the base there, because we want to make sure as much of the threads come through as possible. Some of the glue got on the threads. In a couple seconds when that starts to dry, I'll just kind of peel it off and it won't be any kind of an issue. That's another thing I like about hot glue, is it comes off real clean from pretty much any surface. If you make a mistake or you have to undo it or get somewhere that it shouldn't have gotten. Because this one melted for whatever reason, it's not perfectly flat anymore. So what I just did there was I was making sure the alignment was correct, so I know how to put it back on and align the two halves to the deformation that it has now. And because once you put the glue on, you got to put it on pretty quickly. There's no time to make sure the alignment is correct. So again, I'm going to use a copious amount of glue, and that's very important on this one in particular because of the way it is and because it had to get cut more so than just broken apart where it was sealed together. There is going to be a fair bit of gap on this one, and the glue is going to fill it in nicely. So I'm going to press it together very firmly to make sure it can go as tight as it can, and then I'm going to rely on the glue to fill in whatever gaps happen to be left over. And then once the glue starts to dry, about 15-20 seconds, I'll be able to start breaking off the excess that's around the sides. You see it's not quite ready to go yet. If it just moves, then it's still too wet. If it starts to break, then it's dry enough to start going. And now it's getting dry enough to start coming off. It was kind of where it was thick there, it wasn't dried enough yet, so I'm going to go around the other side to give it some more time. And this one didn't break off quite as clean as the other one did. You can see there's still a little bit of pieces here and there. You can just take your finger and go over it a few times. That'll kind of scrape off any of the excess and make a nice clean seal. And here's what it looks like lit up. Because this one melted and slightly deformed the way it did, this one's not perfect. You can see there is some light coming through at the seam on the left half of the bulb. If you wanted to get very particular about it, you could probably sand it down, the top and the bottom piece of the seam, so that it's flat again, and then put it back together, not have that problem. But when this is on the tree, you really don't notice it. We're noticing it now because we're analyzing it under high definition video. In a typical use case, it looks fine.